Welcome, and thank you for joining today's conference, Market Surveillance Committee meeting. Before we begin, please ensure you have opened the chat panel by using the associated icon located at the bottom of your screen. If you require technical assistance, please send a chat to the event producer. All audio lines have been muted. If you wish to enter the question queue, please enter #2 on your telephone keypad, and you will be entered into the queue. With that, I'll turn the call over to Dr. Benjamin Hobbs, Chair of the Market Surveillance Committee. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Janelle. Hi, I'm Ben Hobbs, and welcome to a meeting of the MSC. We're meeting today to consider the adoption of an opinion on flexible ramping product refinements. This feels a little bit like the Major League Baseball schedule with games crammed in nooks and crannies and double headers, which we thought were extinct. So today we do have a double header. There'll be an additional meeting later today at 1 p.m. To consider opinion on the energy storage and distributed energy resources for initiative. And tomorrow at 3 p.m. there'll be yet another meeting to consider adoption of opinion on Order 831. The drafts for all of these have been posted. And so anyway, I'll start this meeting first by introducing the folks who are around the virtual table. So with me are the other members of the MSC, Jim Bushnell and Scott Harvey. And then from the ISO, we have Daniel Tavel, Don Trethway, Greg Cook, Brad Cooper, and Shami Davis. And they'll be available to address comments and questions as well as we will. As usual, the agenda will consist of a public comment period, followed by a summary of the opinion, comments by the MSC members, and then we'll open it up to comments and questions from those of you who are listening. We'll then consider amendments if appropriate, typos, correction, that sort of thing, and vote on it. Let's see. So let's first start with the public comment. And as usual, if it's a comment about the agenda item, the FRP, if you could hold that comment till later and rather comment on other items. And before we have public comment, I'd like to give Greg Cook an opportunity to talk a little bit about what the ISO has planned in terms of a report and public involvement concerning the events of August. Greg?
Yeah, thanks, Ben. Good morning, everyone. So just to let everyone know, we are currently working on an analysis and report on the mid-August heat wave events. This will be looking at, not only supply-demand conditions, but also, how the markets were working during that period of time. We're anticipating publishing that report early next week, and then we will be having stakeholder discussions on that following that. So just wanted to let everybody know that that's coming, and let's hopefully, provide some more insights as to those events. So that's it, Ben.
Thank you. And I imagine there'll be lots of opportunities to discuss that then. And at our next MSC meeting, I'm sure this will also be on the agenda. Okay, so at this point, I'd like to open it up for public comment and questions about issues other than the flexible ramping product. So operator, can you invite folks to queue up and see if there's anybody on the line?
Yes. To enter the verbal question queue, please press #2 on your telephone keypad, and we will unmute your line. No questions at the moment. I will keep an eye on it.
Okay, thanks very much. Okay, so now we'll turn to a summary of the opinion, and I'll just say to begin that we were asked to comment on the ISO's proposal for certain refinements to the flexible ramping product. In particular, the implementation of a nodal delivery test. The idea is to make sure that the FRP that you procure is actually deployable. And it's something that we have mentioned and have had concerns with over several years, the bottling up of FRP behind constraints because it's FRP is, at least within the ISO, was acquired on a system-wide basis. We discussed this initiative last October and last May, and the general issues involved motivating this initiative have been discussed in several meetings over the previous 3 years. And so I'd like to invite Dr. Harvey to summarize the analysis and recommendations, the opinion, and then Jim and I may add some comments after that, and then we'll turn to the lines. Scott?
Thanks, Ben. As Ben explained, the nodal delivery test that's proposed as part of this initiative is intended to address what at this point appears to be the most critical weakness of the current implementation of the FlexiRamp design, which is that the FlexiRamp that's counted upon to meet the ramp target for a particular balancing area apparently often cannot be dispatched to meet variations in net load within that balancing area because of transmission constraints that are not being adequately accounted for in scheduling the ramp capability. As explained in the opinion, we therefore support the development and implementation of the nodal delivery test as a means to reduce the frequency and extent of such stranded ramp capability and allow the FlexiRamp design to better achieve its intended purpose. The method that the CAISO proposes to test deliverability to model variations in net load as distributed between the distributed load reference bus and the location of intermittent resource output seems to us to provide a reasonable starting point for this design. However, we need to keep in mind, as we discussed in the opinion and going forward, that this modeling assumption is just an assumption, and how such a design will perform in operation is uncertain. In actual operations, there isn't going to be just a single distribution of the location of net load uncertainty. There will be many distinct distributions of these variations, and some will be small variations, and some will be large variations. Some will require only that some of the FlexiRamp may be dispatchable, while others will require a lot to be dispatchable. And so actual variations in net load are likely not going to be spread out across the footprint of the CAISO or the rest of the Western EIM in the manner that's modeled by the deliverability test, but will probably be distributed in a wide variety of other ways and concentrated at particular locations. So there's not a well-defined, clearly best method for testing the deliverability of a given set of resources that could potentially be dispatched, given they could be dispatched to meet a wide variety of levels of magnitudes and locations of variations in net load. Nevertheless, we think this is a good starting point. We need to recognize, though, that there's also a trade-off between incurring higher costs to schedule FlexiRamp at locations which can more often be dispatched and incurring lower costs to schedule FlexiRamp, but incurring the cost of sometimes not being able to make use of all of it because of transmission constraints. So the end point of this, as we discussed in the opinion, is that while we expect the proposed modeling of net load uncertainty as described by the CAISO will provide a useful starting point, we think adjustments in this modeling design will likely be needed over time, at least, to achieve an appropriate balance between cost and deliverability. We also observed that there are potential complexities in the interaction between the locational constraints, the FlexiRamp demand curve, and the price of energy that could lead to unanticipated outcomes that will need to be evaluated and perhaps addressed. So that's why, in the opinion, we recommend and we anticipate that it will be desirable for the CAISO to undertake some testing of the nodal deliverability test using some of the historical dispatch intervals that they've already analyzed and found there were stranded capacity. And this capacity could, this evaluation could assess whether the design performs at least roughly as intended in these intervals, or whether there are issues involving the design that need to be addressed prior to implementation. The California ISO's price performance report doesn't appear to have identified any other critical issues with the current FlexiRamp implementation, but there's still potential for issues. We recognize there is potential for these issues to become more apparent once the nodal delivery test is implemented and the deliverability issues are resolved. And these considerations are why we recommended that in addition to carrying out some testing, the CAISO build flexibility into the software design so that changes in the modeling of the location of variations in net load can be implemented without long delays if it becomes apparent that some are needed. A final topic that we talked about in the opinion is that if the nodal delivery test performs even roughly as intended, the flexi-ramp demand curve should start to provide a more graduated price signal for rising levels of ramp scarcity than it does in the current framework. Moreover, if the flexi-ramp design and nodal test works well enough for the operators to reduce their use of inflated load conformance adjustments to maintain ramp capability, there should be some reduction in the frequency of power balance violations, with instead more graduated increases in energy prices as determined by the flexi-ramp demand curve, which is what was intended originally. However, while it will provide some improvement in pricing with respect to ramp, the flexi-ramp demand curve only provides improved shortage pricing for ramp capability. It does not address the broader need for improved shortage pricing for capacity shortages, which we'll be talking about more in the context of 831 and other initiatives. So I'll stop there and turn it back to Ben and Jim to add their thoughts.
Okay, and thank you, Scott. Jim, would you like to add anything?
No, not at the moment.
Okay. This is Ben. I will just note that, like the original flexi-ramp constraints, the contingency modeling enhancements, and the remedial action schemes initiatives that the ISO has had, this initiative is moving the ISO market software further in the direction of modeling multiple scenarios to check dispatch feasibility and perhaps cost even. These are extensions that have been argued for by some power systems engineers and academicians over the last 10 or 20 years to consider uncertainty, not knowing what will happen, or variability in power markets, but raises the curse of the dimensionality because there's no end to the number of scenarios you could consider. But it may well be that a judicious choice of scenarios and perhaps even attaching some probabilities to them might result in more cost-effective definition implicitly rather than explicitly of reserves that are needed to deal with the vastly growing variability and uncertainty that system operators need to deal with. And as our computational capabilities improve, this may be possible to include. Of course, just because you can compute it doesn't mean that you should. And it could be that in the interest of transparency and rapid turnarounds, that the degree to which we go down this road of checking feasibility and costs of multiple scenarios will be, you may not want to go as far down as possible. So this discussion will raise its beautiful head in many other contexts in the future. For example, as we know that the DMM has proposed that, as mentioned, Scott has discussed, and is in the opinion, perhaps having a flexible ramping type of product that is more than one advisory, is more than one interval out into the future, because there are ramps of various durations that are uncertain. But I'll let you reiterate that I'm strongly in support of the conclusion in this opinion that these possible enhancements these possible further journeys down the road of considering the feasibility and costs of operation under different contingencies, we need to get the present flexible ramping product concept working well before we should consider the possible benefits and the issues associated with implementation of more sophisticated concepts. Okay, so if let's see if there are any public comments or questions on the phone lines. Janelle, could you check and see whether anybody's queued up?
Sure, absolutely. I think we do actually have one hand raised at the moment. We'll go to that first speaker. Speaker, you are unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, this is Bonnie Blair. I represent the Six Cities group, and I have a question about sort of the follow-up evaluation of the impacts of these modeling changes. And one type of analysis that I didn't see mentioned in the opinion, and I wondered if it were a sort of a deliberate omission or not, was an analysis of whether the modeling improvements would actually result or do actually result over some period of time in either the frequency or magnitude of operator adjustments, and I wondered if you could address that.
Okay, thanks, Bonnie. Scott, would you like to get the first shot at this?
Sure. I think we envision that being one of the many things the CAISO needs to look at. We didn't really create a list of all of the items that the CAISO needs to examine, but one of them, ultimately the question is, does this design make the FlexiRamp product work and serve its intended purpose? And so an initial step is to look at, does it improve the deliverability of the ramp capability, and does it do so without undue costs, and does it do so without unintended consequences? And then, as I indicated in some of my comments, ultimately we're hoping that this will reduce the need for operator actions. As we discussed in the opinion and has been discussed at almost every MSC meeting, I think in one context or another over the past 5 years, the need for ramp capability drives a huge number of operator ad hoc actions that probably raise consumer costs, and ultimately the goal here is to reduce the need for those ad hoc actions. So while we didn't explicitly mention that, it is the end point of improving this design.
And do you have any sense of kind of over what period you would look at that, or kind of expect to see some sort of pattern of reduced operator adjustments?
Well, I think that the first step, as I said, is to see that the design's working as intended, and I think the operators are going to have the same feeling themselves, that they're going to take a while to become confident in how FlexiRamp works and that they have the ramp they need, and that I wouldn't expect to see a night and day impact, but I'd hope to start to see an impact after 6 months to a year. I mean, it may depend on what, going in the fall, they might not start to change their behavior until we make it through the next summer, but at some point, in that time frame, after there's some operational experience, we'd hope to see the magnitude of load conformance adjustments decline, and if not, we ought to start asking why and what else is going on.
Thanks. That's really helpful.
Yeah. So Bonnie, you raised a good point, and of course it would be desirable to evaluate all sorts of conditions. Do say 365 days of simulations. But these are, of course, there's a cost to this in terms of staff and everything else. So a logical approach is to perhaps look at some high-stress cases first, and if the deliverability improvements, if the frequency of power balance violations are obvious, then that's a really good sign. I think of what the ISO did with the contingency modeling enhancements, that they looked at a handful of stress cases, and in a couple of those, they found some differences that showed cost savings relative to the minimum online constraint. It's definitely desirable to have more than the handful of days, of course, to look at. And so this will be a trade-off that the staff would have to evaluate. Knowing that the stakeholders, yourself, and we on the MSC will be very interested in, having as much evidence as possible. Jim, you want to say anything?
Nope, you covered it well.
Okay. Operator, is there anybody else lined up?
Yes, we do have one more caller in the queue. Caller, your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Good morning. This is Albus Svoboda from PG&E. I just wanted to say I enjoyed the opinion. I think one thing you are pointing toward is that there might be a couple of different kinds of need for flexible ramping, one of which is being addressed clearly in this formulation, which is kind of a structural ramping need due to the overall uncertainty in load and renewables. And then there's a more dispersed kind of need for flexible ramping that you seem to be alluding to, which could arise almost anywhere. One thing I just wanted to add on to in terms of the need for some sort of staggering of work on this is that there's also a need to enable resources such as batteries to provide services, firming services that could potentially reduce the need for extreme software modifications, which, as you point out, all are pretty costly at this point. So I think there's a lot to be. It may not be in the right time frame, as Scott was talking about 6 months, but I think there's the potential for firming on both the load and the generation side to reduce some of the need for this sort of more dispersed, flexible ramping over time, and there's a need to make sure that there's enough of a benefit to doing that that it actually potentially might get done. So thanks.
This is Scott. I just want to clarify that when I was talking about the potential for lots of distributions of variations in net load, I was still referring to variations that are occurring due to variations in intermittent resource output, either in front of the meter or behind the meter. But my point was rather that those aren't going to be necessarily symmetrically distributed across the footprint in proportion to the distributed load bus or proportionate to intermittent resource output, but rather it might be, concentrated in one DLAP or another DLAP or at 8 particular large, solar generators in the Southwest. And I wasn't envisioning, thinking about a different sources of intermittent resource output, just recognizing that this isn't a single outcome, but thousands, of different outcomes over the day and many outcomes during the day that as Ben was explaining, it isn't the old deterministic world when we're modeling, this distribution of outcomes we've got to respond to. And I do think batteries are part of the evolution, but I actually think that the batteries their next step beyond regulation may be to providing FlexiRamp, and that will be rather than meeting necessarily long pulls, but maybe the next wave will be to in part provide this balancing over the day, which wouldn't drain their power as rapidly.
Right.
So we want to set up a design that accommodates, an evolution of different resources meeting different needs.
Right. I agree with that. But I also think batteries potentially can essentially forestall by essentially sort of the solar plus storage paradigm taken further, they can essentially create resources that are much more certain in their pattern of delivery than intermittents are currently. Essentially, you can modify the ramping characteristics of intermittence at the source, then you also eliminate some of the need for that flexible ramping product.
Alva, I agree with that, but like you said, the key is the incentive side. I feel like the designs pretty much rely on paying for reducing volatility rather than charging for creating volatility. And therefore, it would kind of be a paradigm shift to try to think about how to, provide an incentive almost on the load side to smooth more output or input.
Yes, you're putting your finger on it. I mean, that's why I'm always a little concerned about changes in the market software kind of getting ahead of. I don't know what the proper means of incenting that kind of behavior, but obviously that's the behavior you'd like, is to have people who are building intermittent resources or people on the load side to be essentially making themselves as robust as possible to the grid as a whole. So. Well, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Alva. Thanks, Jim and Scott. Operator, do we have anybody else?
There are no more questions in the queue at this time. As a reminder, pressing #2 on your telephone keypad will indicate that you wish to ask a question.
Okay. Has anybody raised their virtual hand?
Not at this time.
Okay, thank you. All right, at this point in the agenda then, I would like to go on to consideration of adopting the opinion. First I'll entertain a motion to adopt, and if the motion is made, then we'll consider possible, if needed, any changes, and that's correction of typos, et cetera, and then we'll have a vote. So can I have a motion, please?
I move to adopt.
Okay, Dr. Bushnell moves to adopt. Do I have a second?
Scott Harvey seconds the opinion, seconds the motion.
Okay, Jim has moved and Scott has seconded the motion to adopt the opinion. Do we have any changes? I've noted there are a few typos on page 12. And let's see, I would suggest that if these typos are all minor, that we just sort of bundle them into one amendment to the motion. So on page 12, let's see, just going down the page, the first line, we have a typo. It should be increased rather than increased, with a D at the end. Then in the first line, in the nodal delivery test accuracy, second line, sorry, the first word the should be there. There's no possibility for it to be dispatched. In the fourth line of that paragraph, there is a stray word, be. It should just say it is not possible. Then in the next to last line of that same paragraph, the word that should be inserted before will lead, so energy market prices, that will lead to unintended outcomes. And then finally, at the next to last line of the page in the footnote, let's see, after the word few, that should have said few downward power balance violations. Let's see, did anybody find any others?
No, I didn't.
You're a better editor than I am, Ben. Nope.
I had a lot of help on that. It wasn't me, actually. Take credit for that. But okay. So let's see. Then kind of let's see. So I would like, therefore, let's see, Robert Rules of Order. Can I just simply ask for a vote subject to these corrections? Or do we need a formal amendment? Does anybody want to correct me on procedure?
Scott's not going to correct you.
Yeah, is that directed to the ISO or to us?
Yeah, I'm not sure if anybody has their Robert's Rules of Orders handy. So I would, if there is an objection, then I would like to ask for a vote to adopt the opinion with the minor corrections on page 12 just enumerated. Okay, Jim? Would you vote?
Let's see. So we're just voting, or are we?
We're voting on adopting the opinion subject with these changes.
With the amendments. Okay. Yes, I vote yes.
Okay, Scott?
Yes.
Okay, and I vote yes. So the opinion has been adopted unanimously with several typos corrected. So that concludes the agenda, except for a future business. As I said, the second game of this doubleheader, for which you have to pay a second admission, I'm afraid, will be this afternoon at 1 p.m. Pacific time. And then tomorrow we have another game, and that will be at 3 p.m. So those will be on ESDR 4 and Order 831, respectively. And again, the opinions are available for your reading pleasure ahead of time, posted on the MSC website. Jim, Scott, is there anything else you want to bring up?
Scott has nothing to add.
Nope, nothing. That can't wait for the next two calls. Okay.
Well, let me thank the staff, Danielle and Don, as well as Greg and Brad and Shami for your work on making this call and this opinion possible. Danielle and Don, do you want to say anything else? Anything about the opinion, or we'll just simply see you this afternoon?
I have no comment, Don.
Yeah, no comment from me.
Okay, thanks. And thanks again for your hard work on the proposal. So, all right. So, operator, we can therefore conclude this call, and I look forward to hearing from many of you at our next call later this afternoon. So, Janelle, you can end the.
Thank you. That concludes our conference. Thank you for using Event Services. You may now disconnect.